Good evening. Welcome. My name is Alessandra Moctezuma, and I'm the gallery director here at Mesa College. And I thank you all for being here with us today to hear artist Lynda Frese. And first of all, I just wanted to thank Lynda for being so wonderful. She came here last Wednesday to help us with the installation of the work, and she's been working very hard, and I know you must be tired, but she's still gracious enough to be here with us tonight.
I'm playing hooky.
Yeah. So I just wanted to thank her from really the bottom of our hearts for being here. And I also wanted to thank Pat Vine, because she helped me get all this. Okay, she's here. She's never here. Finally, I got her here one day. She's never here for the lectures because she's always, cleaning up down. So I told her, you have to be here. And also I wanted to thank the students in our museum's gallery studies class, because they're the ones that help us put the shows together, and they help us with the reception. So a big round of applause for them too. And I just wanted to introduce Lynda, and I apologize for reading from her bio, but I usually forget something important when I just do it off the top of my head. So I just tell you a little bit about Lynda. Lynda Frese was born in 1956 in Jacksonville, Florida. She received both a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1978 and a Master's of Fine Arts in 1986 from the University of California, Davis. In 1986, Frese relocated to the Lafayette, Louisiana area to teach at the University of Southwestern Louisiana, where she's an associate professor. Her work
Now it's the University of Louisiana, and now I'm a professor.
Oh, I guess this was.
That's fine. That's all right.
Her work has been exhibited in solo exhibitions and institutions, including the DSSA Museum in Santa Clara University in California, the John Michael Kohler Arts Center in Wisconsin, University Art Museum, the University of Southwestern Louisiana at Lafayette. And among the numerous exhibitions in which her work has been included are those at the Samuel Harn Museum of Art, the University of Florida, at Gainesville, the Houston Center for Photography at Texas, and Leo Castelli Gallery in New York. And examples of the artist's work are found in the permanent collections of several museums, including the Mississippi Museum of Art at Jackson, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in California, and the Santa Barbara Museum of Art in California. And I'm sure there's many more that have been added since then. Okay, well, thank you very much for being here, and here is Lynda.
All right, thanks, Alessandra. Well, you can hear me okay? You can tell I'm so happy to be here playing hooky from school. It's been great working with Alessandra and Pat. It's been a real collaboration to put the show together. And it's an image and text exhibition, and I think that this installation of the image and the text works the best that I've ever seen it before. And it was an interesting discovery to finally give ourselves permission to write on the walls of the gallery. And it's, I think the text with the handwriting gives it a very intimate diaristic appeal, and it really helps you dip into the history and the text and then go back and forth between the images. So let's turn off the lights, and I'm going to start talking about the pictures here. It is a collaboration with my partner, Barbara Allen, who wrote the text, and we started working on it in 1996. The exhibit is a series of collaborative projects. There are 4 of them, which examine the influence of gender, memory, and history in the shaping of place in Louisiana. In memory, persons and places coalesce. They form a geography of recollection, an important element which reinscribes the lives of these women. As significant as memory are the social spaces of public and private discourse which shape gender and identity within the culture. So this project is really about, it's a philosophy of memory. It's about history and memory and how they work together. And for me, with my photography work, it's really about time and place, which are 2 of the most strong ideas in photography. And they always have been, and they haven't changed. This is a kind of geography of recollection, and it's also a way to think about the past and to think about history, knowing that there's not just one way to know the past, but there are many ways to know the past. There are many ways to go to and from, back and forth. The first set of pictures I'm going to show you are from they are in consecutive order. The first project was about Marie-Thérèse Quen, and we picked these 4 women because they really they go across centuries. There is Quen from the 18th century. Pentalba and Laveau were basically contemporaries of each other in the 19th century. And then there's the 20th century ecologist, Carolyn Dorman, who we'll talk about. And there were different ways of gathering the research too, because of the kind of records and archives that were available. What we did is we went back to the places where those women lived, and we looked into the archives, the documents, the pictures, etchings, old maps. We talked to people. Sometimes, well, in the case of Dorman, people knew her because she died in 1960. In the case of Marie-Thérèse, who died in the late 1700s, her descendants live on the Cane River. And if you heard that music tonight, the lead singer in that Zydeco band is from the Cane River. And a lot of those people identify themselves as the Cane River people, and they're descendants of Marie-Thérèse Quen. I started off with this picture and the picture called Bewitchment. This picture really has a lot of resonance for me in the work I'm doing right now too, because it started a process of investigating the way that different religious ideas intersect or overlap with each other. So I have the Madonna. This Madonna comes from the first black church that was built on the Cane River, and it was a church that was built for people of color, and it's still extant. And in the water you can see the snakes, and those are related to the Caribbean religious influences that are very strong in Louisiana still today. So you can see the snake that the Madonna is standing on top of, which in Catholicism is a symbol of evil and temptation. And in the voodoo culture, the snake is the symbol of rebirth and energy and sexuality. So some of the things I deal with as an artist are the liquidity of symbols and how they change and the kinds of associations we bring to them. But the Cane River was a place of meditation, but it was also a place of commerce, because on the plantation, that was how the goods went up and down and were traded across the South Louisiana and North Louisiana. And in the background, 2 women, Creole women in a pirogue. That's a flat-bottom boat that you can traverse the swamps with. It's you can go into real thick, swampy areas with it. I'm going to talk also, I'll just jump back and forth about the technology that I'm using. And let's see how this works. Oh, great. I'm using a program called Photoshop. And I've been using it for about 10 years. In fact, I have a manual called Photoshop 2.5, which is probably a collector's item now. because now Photoshop is up to 7.0 and it just gets more and more complex and intricate. It's a very deep program, and even the people that have created it don't understand all the things that it can do. But as a collage artist, when I discovered Photoshop on the computer, I understood it intuitively, immediately, and just went right in through the back door and got into it. It's a way to cut and paste photographs and collage them together, and especially with the newer programs, if you can imagine a series of levels in which you put images on levels, and the level on the top is the one that's is in the most foreground, and as they go down, they can become variously, progressively buried, and then you have this backdrop image. So in this picture is the backdrop of an old Creole house up on the Cane River, and it's got the characteristic buissage. It's made with mud and Spanish moss that they mix into the mud to insulate the house. And it's it's very strange feeling when you walk into these rooms. They're very. I photographed this on a rainy day, and it just had a real damp, moist feeling to it. Marie-Thérèse Quenquen was, of course, died way before photography was discovered / invented, and so there aren't any photographs of her, and there aren't any portraits of her either because of her economic class. It was the aristocracy that got their pictures painted more often than anyone else. So what I did is I photographed a pair of shoes from that period, and I used those as a kind of symbol for Marie-Thérèse. And this picture, for me, really speaks about the relationship between Metoyer, this white French planter, and Quenquen, who was born a slave and was lent to Metoyer. And the legend or folklore has it that they were romantically involved for many, many years. She had 15 children. 15 children, and so did Marie Laveau have 15 children. The sex and fertility were so intimately linked then that these women just, I guess they were tired. But these are, then there's also some other symbols of fertility, the urns and the hair. The hair, I scanned right into the computer, so you'll see as I go along some of the objects that I take, and I put them right down on the scanner bed and scan the objects and make a digital image of the object. This picture is called Slavery, and it was a difficult picture to make because I think it's hard to understand from a 20th or 21st century perspective about slavery, but this was a room which she built on the plantation to house the slaves that were misbehaving. She didn't believe in corporal punishment, and so she started imprisoning the slaves instead of whipping them, and she started this trend all up and down the Cane River. This house is the architecture is called an African beehive, and it's after an African architecture from the south. And the rings are slave bracelets and collars, and they have this fascination. They're alternately beautiful and horrific, and those were from a collector in North Louisiana. So I took those and scanned those into the computer too and laid those on top. So there's a number of different photographs in here, the interior of the building and the exterior of the building, and then the depth of field of the cane, the fields in the background. This is treehouse, and it has up in the trees, it's got a picture of the Melrose Plantation. This is an aerial shot of the Cane River, and these are all Cane River descendants, people from that region in Louisiana. from the notebooks of Melrose, and it's a picture about family and the patchwork quilt of this woman's life. She was, when she met Metoyer, she had 5 black children that were also slaves, and she had, I think she had 6 or 7 children with Metoyer. They were never able to marry because interracial marriages were forbidden by the church, but he was partial to his children, we can tell from the documents, and Metoyer gave her a parcel of land and money with which she built this plantation, and it was a very successful plantation. With the money that she made, she bought the freedom of her children and her children's children. So for her, money was really freedom. And I think at the time of her death, there were about 50 or 60 slaves that she owned. But there was some evidence that she also went and purchased slaves who were hurt or handicapped or ill in some way. So the people that worked on her plantation were extraordinarily loyal. This is a bale of cotton in the front. This is all antebellum money. 1780 at the top, that was the year that she got her freedom. She was 43. This is the bank, Canal Bank, Citizens Bank in New Orleans. And this money was instantly worthless when the Civil War began. This is Melrose Plantation in the background. Then we're going to move on to the Baroness Pontalba. She was an aristocrat, and she's most well known for the Pontalba apartment buildings that were built in Jackson Square, New Orleans. This is an oil painting of her in the center. There were a couple photographs of her at the end of her life, but this portrait of her, she was a really beautiful woman, was taken, was painted when she might have been in her late 20s, early 30s. She lived most of her life in Paris. She entered into an arranged marriage when she was a teenager and signed over all her inheritance money and land to her husband and lived unhappily ever after that. And in fact, her mother was also a builder. Her mother built a palace in Paris, which is now the American Embassy. So this is the American Embassy, what is today the American Embassy in the background, and a stairwell of the Pontalba apartments on the right. And all these objects are from that era, that 1830s, 40s, from the Louvre collection, and also some things from the Pontalba estate. These were some objects in her family. This is her husband up in the upper left-hand corner, and that's the evil father-in-law in the background. This is one of the installations. You can see all the photographs. These are all the single photographs in the back here. Someone asked me what kind of digital camera I had yesterday, and I don't have a digital camera. I don't really like them. I don't really like computers either. But all the pictures that I made are with a traditional 35 millimeter camera, and I printed the pictures in the darkroom, and then I scanned them into the computer and started to collage with them. I'll show you a few more of these. These are some of the single images. So you can cut these out and paste them into different images. I probably made about 200 or 300 photographs and started to select from those. This is Incident at Senlis. This is a pistol of that time. And Pontalba, the Baroness, was shot by her father-in-law. He shot her 4 times, and she lost one of her lungs, and he shot off several fingers on her hand, but she didn't die. He thought that she was dead, and he went downstairs in the Chateau Senlis to the bottom, and was so he was so traumatized by it that he turned the gun on himself and he killed himself. And with his own suicide, she was released from the debts that she owed him psychologically and financially. But she was never able to divorce her husband. But it seems that they may have reached some kind of an agreement later on in life. But there were different laws that were, the laws between Louisiana and Paris were quite different in terms of inheritance and property laws for women, what they could own and what they could control. But it's actually through this unhappy marriage that she turned to building and architecture as a way to create. So for her, it was a way through this trauma and nightmare, was a way that her building was a kind of emancipation for her. This is one of the plates that is from her family. It's got the Pentalba mark on it, and I cracked it in the computer. And, you know, of course, with the computer, you can also change the size, the size of the images too. So this has a kind of comic horror to it. This, I did get to go to this Senlis Chateau. It's right outside Paris, and it's still owned by the Pentalbas. And I met her great grandson. And he let me into the building, and he was married to the Baroness of Paris, the Countess of Paris at the time. This long history. It was so interesting. And between the two of them, they owned 5 chateaus. They do own 5 chateaus, but they're all in a horrific state of disrepair. They have so little money to fix them up. So the day I went and photographed, it was stormy. It was very gothic. And he asked me not to make her into a heroine. He was afraid that we were going to glamorize her too much. He served us Coca-Cola in jelly glasses. These are maquettes of boats from that era, and the waters from the Seine. She crossed the Atlantic 5 times in her life. It took 6 weeks each time. 6 weeks back and forth. And this is a plan. The plan in French. The plan is also the word for map. The city of New Orleans. This is from 1816. So this would be before the Pentalba apartments are built. And this is the French Quarter, the old French Quarter. And here's where the Pentalba apartments are. And here's an old etching of them on the bottom after they've been built. And on the right is an image from the Place du Vosges in Paris, which was an inspiration for her. She loved Paris, and she wanted to bring the cosmopolitan excitement of Paris to New Orleans, which was, at the time, was a pretty dingy, dark city. Some people would say it still is. But it was an interesting city, but it wasn't very sophisticated. She had this idea to build these apartments that had a covered walkway, so you could walk along here and shop and out of the sun and the rain and stay out of the mud. There were, at the time, public hangings took place in the center of the square, and she and Marie Laveau worked to stop those from happening. And then in the bottom right, you can also see, at the time I made the pictures from Paris, there was a Salvador Dali sculpture in the square called The Persistence of Memory. So I decided to leave that in. And on the top are building tools from the 1840s. New Orleans is surrounded by swamp even today. And it's also surrounded by mosquitoes. Even today, we have West Nile now, but then they had yellow fever, and most of the city people, if they had enough money, they would leave New Orleans in the summer and they would go to the coast, what's now the Florida Panhandle, and live out the summers there. It was a disease-ridden city, especially in the summertime. It was quite dangerous, and all the beds had these very romantic mosquito netting over them. So this is a tribute also to Renee Magritte, whose work I really love. So there's kind of a daytime and nighttime feeling to it. This is the Royal Dream. And then this is the symbol of colonial Louisiana, the fleur-de-lis, which is French for the flower of Louis. And it's also the symbol of Paris, France. This was at an opening in New Orleans. This was at the New Orleans Museum. And one of the pictures we printed up, it was 10 by 15 feet. And I wanted to make Michaela life-size. And then I rented an outfit that was like hers with a bustle on the back. And after the opening, we went out into the French Quarter, and I blended right in. No one even looked twice at me. It was really fun to see this printed so large. The digital technology, the file exists in this virtual size, and you can make it into a variety of sizes. So the ones you see in the show, the most fine are the 10 by 15 inches, and then you can blow them up. This is actually a billboard process, so if you were going to look at it up close, you would see tiny dots. And it's not very resolute the bigger it gets, but you stand back from it, so your eyes begin to fill in the missing pieces. So it gets bigger and a little bit less resolute, but you can also see it almost as clearly if you're standing back from it. So it's a really interesting technology. This is a electrostatic billboard process, the same kind of process that they put on billboards and then laminated. There are 3 of those in the show down in the gallery. Caroline Dorman was an early environmentalist, although she wouldn't have called herself that because that term wasn't coined then. She was basically contemporary with the woman who wrote Silent Spring, Rachel Carson. And she lived in North Louisiana, also up near the Cane River. She was friendly with a lot of the Indians and helped them protect their heritage from exploitation. There were a lot of anthropologists and just treasure seekers going up there and digging up the graveyards and pulling things out, and she helped pass legislation to make that illegal. And she was just tireless. She used her writing and her drawing and painting to educate the children and also to educate the Congress. She went back and forth to Washington, D.C. many years during her life. She wrote the enabling legislation for Kisatchie National Park, and she was the first female park ranger in the United States. That was a photograph of her. By the way, there were many, many photographs of her. This is the bayou. And also these are some of her drawings and paintings. She was a botanist. She did so many things. And this is the front porch. A lot of things in Louisiana happen on the front porch. She and her sister built this house in the woods at what's now a nature preserve. These are some of her books and her camera. These are some of the collection of bird nests, and she had an amazing natural collection of objects. And they were so kind and generous when we went up there. They let us photograph and handle and scan a lot of those things. and you know, you have her, all her paints and her typewriter laid out. So with this process, you can float things, and I think there's a kind of dreamlike quality in the way you can put things together. These were small life-size paintings, very meticulous paintings of flower leaves, iris. Her specialty was the Louisiana iris, and she discovered several new varieties. And I scanned them and cut them out and placed them into a black and white photograph of her nature preserve in winter. I went up there and stayed a few days sleeping out in the woods. So we tried to follow the path of these women and really understand the site and also the kinds of stories that people would tell us and look into the records and the official archives, but also lots of folklore and storytelling. This is one of her photographs laying across the top. She was an artist and a scientist. She was an interesting combination of the two, and it helped her understand and teach the intricacies of nature. But by the time she died, most of the longleaf pine forests were destroyed. All the virgin pines were destroyed in Louisiana. There's one that still exists, and it's hard to find because people don't want to tell you about it because they don't. There are some lumbermen who take great pride in cutting down the biggest tree they can find. So some of those old groves are hidden. They're hard to get to. This is one of her medals on the bottom. One of the stories I liked about her, we have a problem with red ants in the South, and they build this kind of nest like a little volcano, and when you step in them, they boil up and they give you really nasty bites. And they're kind of scary, and the government decided that what they would do is drop DDT from airplanes onto the land in Louisiana to kill the red ants. And it didn't kill the red ants, but it killed the fish and it killed the birds. And she pointed this out and kept really good records of it and finally stopped the DDT poisoning from the air. It's Marie Laveau, the voodoo priestess in New Orleans. She was a contemporary of Pentalba, and there is a painting of her in the museum that is purported to be Laveau, and so this is that image in the center. This is a kind of 18th century arrangement of objects with the main image in the center. In the bottom is an old etching and a photograph of New Orleans, and swirling around her head is the Congo Square, which she helped found as a place where the slaves could congregate on Saturday night. And some people believe that this is where jazz was born, these all-night drumming and singing and dancing music events. She was a very powerful woman. She started off, the story is that she started off as a hairdresser, and like Marie Therese, she had many, many children. She's wearing this tignon. At the time, the quadroons, or the Creole women, were so beautiful, and they were so elegant when they went out that some of the governors passed a law that they had to wear these tignons on their head to distinguish them from the white women. And the law really backfired because the Creole women took this and they started to embellish the tignon by adding more and more jewels and flowers, and it became another way for them to act out their their beauty in public, and she loved to dress up. She loved to dress up. She loved to go through the town in her carriage. This is New Orleans, old New Orleans. I think that Laveau she had a lot of secrets, and she knew a lot about the secret life in New Orleans. She was able to move between classes and economies easily. She started off as a hairdresser, but as she practiced the arts of voodoo, she started to sell those and use that as a kind of business. And her clients were both the rich and the poor. And you have to remember, too, that at this time there were very few things that women could do for a living. So the fact that she could earn money doing this was very important to her. Unless you were like Pontalba and you had a huge inheritance. But women's lives were very narrowly confined economically. So there are images of the old French Quarter. This is Pirates Alley in the bottom, the swamp along the top. These are some old instruments from Congo Square. Spiderweb up in the corner. This is a quote from Roland Barthes about myth. Thus, every myth can have its history and its geography. Each is in fact the sign of the other. A myth ripens because it spreads into tabloids, the home of the suburbanite, of private means, the hairdresser's salon, the streetcar. The social geography of myths will be difficult to trace, but we can say that its place already exists. The Marie Laveau story was a challenge because there were so many myths about her swirling around already. In fact, there's a voodoo museum in Louisiana, in the French Quarter, which makes her into a kind of heroine. But it was hard to find out the true or the real authentic information about her life because she's been so mythologized and both revered and feared. And I think that was something that she definitely worked on in her life, to use that as a way to gather power about her. There are different kinds of ways that people have described or explained the kind of power that she had. Because she started in hairdressing, she definitely knew people would reveal secrets to her, and she would tuck those away and use them later on. But also, people were traumatized. They were lovelorn. They were lost. They were sad. They wanted some kind of instant fix. And voodoo was a great way to deal with some of those issues. If you could get a potion for it, then it would be, if you put your faith into that, maybe it was going to help. And even today, when you go to her grave, in the background, this is the gravestone in St. Louis Cemetery, and people still go there and they say prayers or give her offerings. They make spells. They do these X's, 3 X's in a row. And when you go to visit her grave, there are plates of food and bottles of wine, glasses of beer. People leave her things. And they would leave her gifts to thank her. Sometimes it was money. I'm sure that was her favorite thing to get. But also, sometimes it was plaques. And in another realm, in the Catholic Church in Louisiana and in New Orleans, were these grottos to the Madonna where people would leave plaques of thanks and merci. And even when you when you visit those, they're full of voodoo symbols and signs. I'm going to show you some of those too. So this is from the old pharmacology museum there, the bottles, and it has a kind of transparency to it, which I think speaks about clairvoyance. Some people think that one of the things that gave her power was that she had a genuine gift for clairvoyance, that she really did seem to intuitively know things about people and use that to her advantage. This is a piece on the card that is so elegant. This is a veve, this sign here of the hearts, and that's a symbol of Erzulie, the goddess Erzulie from Haiti, from the voodoo pantheon of gods and goddesses, and she's the mother image in voodoo. So she's the parallel with Mary, the Madonna. And in the background you see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I always say this wrong. Gethsemane. Laveau was known, especially towards the end of her life. She stayed with the men who were on death row, and she would stay up all night with them. She would build altars and pray with them. For Laveau, her Catholicism and her voodoo practice were not in conflict with each other. She went to church every day for her entire life, and she practiced voodoo every day too. For her, it was a business, and there wasn't a push and pull. They worked together. In the middle, you also see the egg, which is a symbol in Christianity of rebirth. And it's also a symbol you also see it on all the voodoo altars. It's, you always have eggs on your voodoo altar. And the gloves, the kind of conjurer's spirit. One of the people we interviewed for this project was the leading voodoo priestess in New Orleans today, Ava K. Gardner. She was an interesting woman. She spent all day with us and took us around on a tour of New Orleans as seen through the eyes of Marie Laveau. And then in the evening, we did a seance with her. So we had all kinds of people that we interviewed, from voodoo priestesses to historians, and as well as looking into the old newspaper articles. Here's one this is from the New Orleans paper. Besides being very beautiful, Marie was also very wise. She was skillful in the practice of medicine and was acquainted with the valuable healing qualities of indigenous herbs. She was very successful as a nurse, wonderful stories being told of her exploits at the sickbed. In yellow fever and cholera epidemics, she was always called upon to nurse the sick and always responded promptly. She went out and fought the pestilence where it was thickest, and many alive today owe their salvation to her devotion. Besides being charitable, Marie was very pious and took delight in strengthening the allegiance of souls to the church. She would sit with the condemned in their last moments. Whenever a prisoner excited her piety, Marie would labor incessantly to obtain his pardon, or at least commutation of sentence, and she generally succeeded. She helped end the public hangings in Jackson Square. It's funny because today in the city, a lot of people don't remember her charitable deeds. They remember the voodoo part of her life is, I guess, more glamorous and more intriguing. And I made a picture about the kinds of kitsch and authentic symbols that go along with the voodoo and Catholic practices in the city. And even today, there's a kind of religious syncretism between the two. There are many parallels and overlaps. This is another veve from the voodoo pantheon. A lot of my students get these veve tattoos on their backs and stomachs. And one girl, I asked her how she had decided on the voodoo veve of Erzulie for her back tattoo, and she said that's a voodoo symbol on my back. I better not tell my grandma that. I didn't know that. And they just pick them because they're beautiful, but they don't really know what they mean. And they're all over the place. I see them all the time on stomachs and backs. So that's one of them. And then up above you can see the voodoo potions. Come to me, love, succeed, get away, draw, kill, lucky dog, get away power. And then also some of the objects, which you can also see in a lot of religious ceremonies, deal with wine and water and food and the idea of finding the supernatural through the natural world. So you in voodoo and also in Catholicism, they believe that you go through the natural world to meet the supernatural, and you do that by dealing with the materials and food and water and wine. And even today, when you're on the bank of the Mississippi, you sometimes see people throwing food into the river or dumping wine, bottles of wine into the river with their prayers or spells. So then I'm gonna end with a really pretty quote about memory, and then I'll take some questions from you. This is a quote about history and memory by Jean-Pierre Vernon. History, as celebrated by memory, is a deciphering of the invisible, a geography of the supernatural. It brings about an evocation of the past. Memory appears as a source of immortality. And I think that's really what the project is about, is looking at history and memory and how they weave together to create these stories. So I think I'll take some questions now if you have. Yeah, it's interesting because you do bounce back a lot of ideas back and forth, but I think Barbara Allen is more of an academic historian than I am, and being a visual artist, we were attracted to different parts of the story. So sometimes she would delve into one direction and I would delve into another direction. And it was her idea to start. She started with the project because she was attracted to architecture in certain places and the kind of stories that they told, to link those up with the folklore or the storytelling that went with that particular building. And when she saw my collaged pictures, she felt that there was a parallel between these collage stories and the way that images could be put together or layered on top of each other. And so it really has evolved. And I have to say that this installation is one of the most poetic interactions between the words and the text and the images, because I think that you really come to them in a different way. I think that language is more of a left brain activity, and looking at art or making art is more of a right brain activity. So they cross back and forth, and we're trying to put something together that I haven't seen before. I'm not really sure how it works. When it works, it really works well. And when it doesn't work, it's off in some way. Sometimes we would start on the project and we would start gathering information, and I would have a very clear idea of a kind of picture that I was going to make, and we would talk about it, and I would tell her, and she would start to gather information that supported that picture. And then, conversely, she would start to talk to me about one theme or idea in this woman's life that she felt was very central to telling about the accomplishments. And she would speak to me about how we would show that in a picture, how we would talk about that idea in a picture. And we had different ways of coming to the subject, but sometimes that was really good because we illuminated different parts of the story that the other person might not have seen. For example, one of the disagreements that we had was we were gathering all these kind of stories, and some of them were very traditional interviews with people who were scholars, historians that knew about the women, and I wanted to go and ask some of these old conjure women about the stories of, like, especially Marie Laveau. I thought that would be really appropriate. So we did end up going to see the voodoo priestess, but we also hired 3 psychics. We would call them psychics. At that time, they would have called them conjure women. And we came up with a list of questions, and we asked the same questions to all 3 women, and we were able to empirically compare them and decide what kinds of information were showing up over and over again. And then we took that information and we went back to the archives and started digging around for proof that this thing might have happened. For example, with Marie Therese, 2 women told us that she had had a handicapped daughter and was very concerned about the safety of this girl because, you know, obviously being a handicapped slave is a dangerous situation. So we went back into the archives and we found evidence that she had this handicapped child, but we never would have known to look for it. So as a historian, that gave her the hives. You know, she was really afraid that she would be discredited. But as an artist, I felt that, you know, any way you can get information, I'm not really judging it. I'm interested in going into the story, and the truth of the story is something that shifts all the time. So that was an interesting, it was an interesting thing that we did, but it was also an interesting disagreement because when we sent it out to different publishers, she wanted to excise that completely. And I thought it was important and interesting and fascinating to the story. So we still haven't come to an agreement about that. But I think that's an interesting example of the difference between how historians, classical historians, gather information and how artists or musicians or people in the arts go about gathering information. New Orleans was a very extraordinary city because it had so many different kinds of people there. And one of the things we discovered was a surprise is that New Orleans in the 1850s was more integrated than it is now because people of color, both slaves and free people, and the white people all lived together under the same roof, sometimes in the same family. And it wasn't necessarily, sometimes the lower classes were the white workers. They weren't necessarily people of color. Sometimes people of color owned lots of slaves. Both Marie Laveau and Quen both owned a lot of slaves. And the neighborhoods were integrated. It was not, the economic classes were not decided by color of skin. And now in New Orleans, you see much more segregation, and you see more segregation between economic classes too. So it depended where people came from too. I mean, some of the Creoles came from Paris, and some came from Haiti, and then there were the Spanish and the Mexicans. It was a real mixture. It must have been an amazing, amazing time to be in New Orleans. Just incredible. And yeah, and I think that syncretism, those ideas that are adopted by another culture, and if they're not accepted, they could be somehow concealed, is such an interesting story too. So when you go into the grotto in the Catholic Church, you have to open this gate that has the voodoo veves all over it. As I said to you yesterday, the workers embedded the Catholic Church with all these voodoo symbols, and they're still there today. And who knows what the priests knew, or maybe they sanctioned them, maybe they didn't know. But it was a way to live amicably together too, and also to allow different kinds of religious practices to exist side by side. I could go through it and take things apart. I think I did 5 pictures a year, so they were, they were slowly put together. This one, you can see in the background the hair, and then can you see the braids weaving through here too? So that's a reference to Marie Laveau's first profession as a hairdresser. And some of the objects here were objects that we used in our voodoo ceremony. And some of the objects here are things that you see in Catholic religious ceremonies. And some of them are kitsch and games and ways that people use those sacred things in a more prosaic way, a more common use. For example, the skeleton at the top. I think here people use the Day of the Dead symbols in a way that's really light-hearted, but also has a shallow meaning and a deep meaning, so you can go to these different levels. So that was something that interested me, and then also photographs that I took from the places where she lived or places that she visited, her haunts. And then at a certain time, at a certain point, as an artist, the image begins to direct you down a path that you're making choices about it, but also the picture is also helping you to make choices too, by classic problems of composition and content and the way the rhythm of the picture moves and the colors. Colors have symbols too. Yeah, sometimes I worked on a few at a time, and then I would go back and forth. Sometimes you get stuck and you're not really sure where to go, so you go on to another project and you revisit it later. And some just come together, just flow, and they're right there. And then other ones you have to tinker with, and show. This is the first time that I've seen the whole group together. This is the first exhibition they've all been put together. So it's interesting to look at them, and I see some pictures that I think are really, really strong, and other ones that I see problems with. If I had a chance, I would go back in and start tinkering with them again. But I think that's true of any artist, that sometimes you hear stories about artists that are putting up exhibitions and they bring in their paints and they start changing things while they're on the wall in the gallery, and there are a lot of stories like that. I think artists are never quite satisfied because you haven't ever really finished what you're doing. We've had conversations with a couple publishers that one of the problems has been the publishers want to categorize the work, so they want to identify it. Is it anthropology, or is it feminism, or is it history? Is it what is this project? Publishers like books to fall into a category so that they can put them on the shelf with other books that are like them. And so that's been one of the problems with the project. And we'll see where it goes. I had lots of conversations with Alessandra about this too. I went to see these underground. I'm very interested in prehistoric art and prehistoric images, and I went to see these underground paintings outside the Città Vecchia, outside of Rome, and they were by the Etruscans. They were about 3000 BC, and they had the heart image on the wall in a line, and that was the earliest time I'd seen the heart image. I don't know. I'm fascinated by where these symbols come from and where they start and how they get borrowed. And then at the same time, there are images that are found in the American Indian caves and the caves in France and Spain and in Australia, and they're the same symbols. I don't know why. It's fascinating. So it's really hard to track them down and say this is the person that invented this symbol. But Carl Jung would say that was there's some kind of universal consciousness that we all share. So they are bound to show up in different parts of the world. Well, in France, they just discovered another cave. They thought that the cave, the famous cave, Altamira, was the oldest cave, and they found one that's twice as old with paintings inside. So, as soon as you figure it out and you think, okay, I've located the source, a new piece of information shows up, and it's really hard to know. But yeah, I mean, there are so many different theories, and I think that this project also, to go back to the idea of truth and storytelling, is saying, well, how many? Is there just one truth, or are there several ways to look at this? Who gets to tell the truth? Is the person who's in power telling more truth than the person who's not in power? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming.